Apple Silicon has brought so much performance to the new M1 Macs to the point where even Windows users like me are now considering MacBooks. And I really found in my MacBook Air that it was incredibly impressive. But I really wanted to isolate how much that was from the fact that it was running on the new M1 chip versus getting to use a MacBook for really the first time extensively in my life. And so I wanted to check out what it looks like for older Macs back on Intel chips. See, now that M1 Macs are here, you can probably expect a significant price drop in older Intel Macs. And so I picked up this, which is not an M1 Mac, but a Intel MacBook Pro from 2020. And it is a pretty incredible device. But should you consider picking up an older MacBook Pro, or should you just opt for one of the newer MacBook Pros with M1 or MacBook Airs? Let's talk about it. This is an OISO, and this is the MacBook Pro 2020 Intel review. Sorry, don't mind me. I'm just going to have to charge this up a little bit. Since Apple didn't bring any sort of redesign with their first round of M1 Macs, this is the exact same design as the new MacBook Pro with an M1 chip. And it's the same design that we've been seeing since 2018. That's not a bad thing. I am still so impressed with this design, and it's still one of my favorite designed laptops out of any laptop, including Windows laptops. Now, I could say that the all aluminum design is getting a little bit dull over time, and maybe a couple more materials would make it more interesting to me, but I still love how clean this entire aesthetic looks. The whole device is technically a little bit thinner than my MacBook Air, but through most of it it's more rectangular shaped to the point where most of the device is thicker. And I really prefer this design over the MacBook Air because it feels like it's more thick and bulky and substantial, whereas the MacBook Air feels a little bit more flimsy. Now, personally, if I had to choose, I'd probably pick this space gray design over the silver in my MacBook Air, but it's really so similar that I don't think it matters all that much. If I had my choice, then I would probably opt for a blue or a red color like you see in Surface laptops, and I really wish Apple would end up bringing those sort of unique colors to their MacBooks, the same way that they've been doing it so to their iPhones in recent years. The display is absolutely incredible, and it gets substantially brighter than the MacBook Air, which is nice to have considering it's getting more and more sunny outside. I think this display is absolutely excellent, and if I had one gripe about it is the fact that it doesn't fill up the entire footprint. Now, this is a compact enough device for me to easily fit it into any backpack, but if I had my preference, I'd want the display to go all the way to the edges in maybe a 14-inch model. Hopefully we'll end up seeing that from Apple this year. But otherwise, this display is all that I can ask for. Wait. Oh yeah. One more issue that I have with it. The fact that it's not touchscreen. And yes, we don't really expect MacBooks to have touchscreens right now, but I can tell you that a MacBook with a touchscreen would be a significant improvement in utilizing iPad apps, or just sometimes I prefer just tapping on the screen when I want to select OK on a checkbox or something like that. If you haven't watched it already, be sure to go check out my video of trying to add a touchscreen to the M1 MacBook Air. It was not a fun experience, but it ended okay. It's kind of ironic that Intel, who obviously makes the chips for this laptop, is now criticizing Apple for not having touchscreens on their MacBooks and saying that users should opt for PCs because they have touchscreens, when Intel makes chips for this laptop too. Whatever. The big differences between this device and my MacBook Air are in the performance and the keyboard. But before we get to those, let's talk first about the trackpad. This is the same trackpad that's in my MacBook Air, but notably, I think because the laptop has more depth, the click somehow feels a little bit more substantial. Something about maybe the vibration motor driving a larger volume could result in this feeling a little bit more natural of a click than a little bit more shallow in the MacBook Air. Maybe it's just my imagination. And then when it comes to the keyboard, now I actually was really intrigued by the concept of the touch bar because I really think eventually we're going to get to the point where our keyboards are very, very kind of versatile and they change based on context. But This solution seems to be kind of like a very beginner step into that. I really didn't appreciate the use of the touch bar. Now, occasionally I did see functions pop up there where I'd actually be able to use it. For example, editing in Premiere Pro, there were a couple pop-up menus that were useful. But more times than not, it would pop up with like an OK and a cancel button, when in reality my mouse is already that close, or I could easily hit the return key and hit OK, or the escape key and hit cancel. I don't understand why the touch bar is really there. I think it would take a large of front end investment on my part and on developers' part in order to make the touch bar just as usable as function keys. Because more so than probably most, I am incredibly dependent on function keys. As a heavy Excel user, I frequently use the F2 key for just about everything. And having a glass F2 key without any sort of feedback is really disappointing. If I did have some sort of vibration feedback coming from the touch bar, then maybe it'll be a little bit better off. But for now, I just found that my hands naturally rest on the keyboard and sit on the function row. And so as a result, I was frequently accidentally pressing buttons on the touch bar without intending to. This is one of the major reasons why I chose the M1 MacBook Air over the new MacBook Pros, specifically for that reason. And I'm glad that I actually don't like the touch bar, because that is now my primary laptop. Outside of my not great experience with the touch bar, the keyboard itself was still excellent. I think this keyboard also feels different from the MacBook Air. Again, maybe it's the thickness of the device or something, but the keys feel like they have a more substantial click and they feel like they give more feedback. And so I actually prefer this over the MacBook Air. I actually feel like I could comfortably type for a long time on this keyboard, where that wasn't necessarily the case with the M1 at MacBook Air. When it comes to performance, I'm a little bit mixed. Now, for me, I didn't see a substantial difference between my experience using the M1 MacBook Air and this device in terms of day-to-day use. I still feel like both are substantially fast enough for me to not feel like I'm being bogged down. But I will say that the fan in this device sometimes turns on for really no apparent reason. I don't feel like I'm overloading the computer with too much, but still the fan will kick in occasionally when I'm just sitting on a desktop or opening Chrome tabs, which is a little bit disappointing. Now, obviously I don't have that problem with new MacBook Airs because it doesn't have a fan. But then the performance really separates itself when you talk about significantly higher level stuff like photo editing or video editing. I absolutely cannot edit videos on this device. I tried a couple times without much luck. And that's really not a surprise. I mean, this is still a thin and light device and, not a relatively powerful chip with no dedicated graphics card. So you wouldn't really expect to be able to edit 4K videos on this device. But that's what really makes the MacBook Air M1 just so impressive, because you can edit videos on it. And so I felt like this was a huge step back in terms of that higher order performance. But if you're not particularly interested in doing that, then it might not be a big difficulty for you. Where I've struggled with MacBook Pros in the past is that this device gets substantially very hot in my lap. And ironically enough, after digging through some forum posts, I saw that Apple specifically labels this as a notebook and not as a laptop, because it is not designed to be used in your lap, or at least that's what the forums said. I don't know of anyone who specifically opts for these devices as notebook desktop devices rather than just sitting in their lap or somewhere. But maybe I'm the crazy one, because those forums seemed like they're full of Apple fans that think it's stupid for someone to use a laptop on their lap. If you didn't pick up on it earlier, this device notably has significantly worse battery life than the M1 MacBook Air. And that's specifically why I plugged it in to charge it. Now, I also needed to plug it in, but I was trying to make a point as well. See, I found that MacBooks have incredibly long duration when sitting idle, which is very impressive, and substantially more than most of my other Windows laptops that I've used in the last couple of years. I can basically just leave the MacBook there for a couple days and then pick it up, and it's still going to have significant amount of battery left, which is excellent. But notably, this is substantially worse than the MacBook Air M1's battery life. Now, I have been using the MacBook Air specifically for video editing and coding and kind of more higher level stuff, more difficult stuff. And I've been getting around 10 to 12 hours of battery life pretty consistently on it. Whereas this, I was getting more around 6 to 8 hours depending on what I was doing. And even when I was getting 10 hours, it was only when I was just using this device for web browsing. And so 10 hours, 8 to 10 hours is still great for probably most people, maybe most students, but don't think that you're going to be using this for a couple work days without having to top up, unlike maybe the M1 MacBook Air. This MacBook Pro was tested on Big Sur with all of the bugs and issues that I've had with it in the past, and it still had some problems. It still seems like Apple's going through some teething pains with the MacBook or with Big Sur on older Macs. But that kind of leads to one of the issues or one of the difficulties that you might see by switching to this or choosing a device like this. Now, Apple has said that they plan on supporting their Intel devices for a couple more years after the transition. Or I don't even know if they've been really explicit in how long that period is. We know that the transition is going to take place over around a 2-year period, and we still expect to see several other MacBooks in their product line, or Macs in their product line, switch from Intel to M1 or Apple Silicon. But we'll have to see if Apple continues to support Intel chips substantially into the future. One benefit that Apple has always had with their MacBooks is the longevity, because there are still people using 2011 MacBook Airs like they bought them yesterday. And I've always had a lot of appreciation and envy of those people, because MacBooks have always been able to retain their value, their performance over time. And a lot of that is because of how well designed they are. But we'll have to see if that sort of value is retained when they switch to a completely new platform in Apple Silicon. Now, when I was looking for specifically this device, I found that there wasn't a significant discount of this device over other MacBooks, and I was over the M1 MacBooks. And so I was pretty confused. I thought that with a completely new chip design, that you'd see an older, substantially, usually worse chip design drop in price, like quite a bit in price. But I haven't really seen that happen on the resale market. Now, that might be partially because the demand for laptops in general has gone up substantially over the last year because of work from home and quarantine. But, I really expected to see significantly decreased prices, and I'm not seeing them. And so, to answer the question that I started with, should you consider getting this over an M1 Mac? Well, if you're paying anywhere near similar prices, I'd say absolutely not. I think the M1 Mac in nearly all cases is substantially better. Now, there might be some people with specific workflows that are reliant on the older chip design in x86. So if you're one of those people, then I'd say that this is still an incredibly compelling device. And I am very surprised that it hasn't dropped in price significantly over the last year. But I'd say that if you specifically are just looking for a new laptop that is able to do everything and is going to last hopefully a long time, then the M1 Macs are probably a better choice for you. Now, I've notably left out a couple advantages of this device over the M1 Macs. So, for example, Thunderbolt compatibility with external graphics cards. So if you want a high-end external graphics card or a high-end graphics card at all, then you're going to have to opt for an Intel Mac, because unfortunately they aren't compatible with the new M1 Macs. Or external display compatibility. So if you want to link up to multiple external displays, this is able to do it, whereas M1s are not able to do it. So that's another advantage. And then finally, Boot Camp. And so for the longest time, I always looked at Boot Camp as kind of silly, because if you want a Windows device, why don't you just buy a Windows device? But Then I actually started using Boot Camp on this device, and I think I saw the light because I was incredibly impressed with the experience of a Windows operating system running on an incredibly high-end MacBook product. And it made me really wish for this premium of a Windows laptop. Now, there are a lot of great Windows laptops on the market, and some of them I would say are comparable with this. But something about the experience was just so refreshing for me. And so that is going to be one of the biggest downsides that I see as someone switching to an M1 chip, not being able to run on Boot Camp. Now, you have an alternative in Parallels and running Windows through a VM with Parallels. I'm going to make a specific video discussing this process, and I'll run side by side this device with a MacBook Air running running Windows through Parallels, and I'll show you what the experience is like. I can tell you right now that my experience to date has not been great using Parallels. So, Boot Camp might be a huge loss if that's one thing that you're interested in. Here's the good news. If you specifically still want an Intel MacBook, then I will be selling this device on my eBay page for the next 7 days. And if you are a viewer of the channel and you use the link down in the description, you can get a special discount on the final value of that product. Thanks again for watching NOISO. I hope you enjoyed this review of the MacBook Pro 2020 with an Intel chip, and I hope you found some good information in making a decision on this versus the M1 Max. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like, get subscribed, and let me know down in the comments specifically what your thoughts are. I'll catch you in the next one.